Here's a story about two best friends, Pete and Johnny. Johnny's family had a pretty good fishing business going on. Several boats, employees, subcontractors. And Johnny's mom gathers up Johnny one Thursday to take this week's catch to town to market. Poor Johnny doesn't want to go. He wants to stay home with the guys and fish. But his mom grabs him by the ears and says, "Sorry, kiddo, you're going with us. Maybe next year when you're older." And his mom ran the ropes in that family. Big Thunder, the kids called her. When you heard her holler, you obeyed. As Johnny and his mom and a few others were leaving, Johnny looks back at the boats, sees his buddy, his best buddy Pete, waving at him from one of the boats. Johnny can't wait till he can be a fisherman. Talking about fish, yeah, I'm busy cleaning out the fish tank today. Yeah, it's got to get done. Anyways, so Johnny and his mom, they go to take this trip to town to pay the bills. There are only so many customers in the town of Bethsaida and Capernaum on the Sea of Galilee. So as most everyone fishes around those parts, the market's pretty much cornered. So usually they sell all of Johnny's family sells to the people in town there in Jerusalem and in the big city. It's a couple days journey from where they lived, there and back, and everyone in town knows Johnny's family. If you had some fish in that town, it was most likely bought from them. You might say they were well connected. Johnny got to know most all the city leaders, the temple families. He got to know them quite well. Yeah, he was from a fishing family, but the family business allowed them certain privileges and connections. The city of Jerusalem had a wall built around it with 12 gates, and they would bring their wares through the gate, appropriately called the fish gate. There were other gates, Sheep's Gate, Mercy Gate, and the Dung Gate. Yeah, that's probably where the sanitation workers hung out. That's where I'd be hanging out. My guess, everything was orderly and made to run daily, smooth and kosher. A little trading, negotiating, and a little buying more supplies, and off they went back home, Johnny and his mom. Later in life, we see Pete's brother Andy down on the river just south of the lake that they lived on. It's the River Jordan. Listening to a guy preach and watching him baptize people. Andy he'd been a student of this teacher for a while, and one day, him and his friends, they were standing there talking to the baptizer when the baptizer points at somebody walking by there and says, "Hey, there's my cousin. Behold the Lamb of God." Well, that got Andy's attention. So him and his buddy started following the baptizer's cousin, Jesus. Jesus walks for a little while, and as they follow after a bit, Jesus turns and says, "What are you guys looking for?" And they answered and said, "Where are you staying?" So he showed them, and they spent the whole day with Jesus. Afterward, Andy went and found his brother Pete and said, "We found the Messiah." He actually even took him to meet him for himself. Yeah. A couple weeks later, Jesus was walking along the coast with a good-sized crowd, and he sees Pete again on the shore, casting his net into the sea with his brother Andy. And why are they still casting their nets at this hour and their boats are docked? Maybe they got skunked. Haven't caught anything all night. That's why they're still casting their nets. Anyways, Jesus has a big crowd following him, and he sees two boats, one of which is Pete. So he and Pete get into this boat, and Pete pushes off from shore a little bit so Jesus can speak to the crowd more easily, so everyone would be able to hear him. Now, mind you, this must be a smaller boat, as if one were sitting down in a bigger boat like John's dad's boat, Zebedee's boats, you wouldn't be able to see or hear anyone sitting in that boat because of the size of it and the way that it's shaped. Jesus says, "Pete, push out a little into the deeper water and drop in your nets. Let's catch us some fish." Pete's like, "Master, Andy and I fished hard all night. Got nothing. They aren't biting. However, if you say so." And wouldn't you know it, they caught so many fish in the net that the nets were breaking. So Pete signaled to shore, hollering, "Andy, you guys get the other boat out here. Help us." got to drag this net to shore. It's full. Now they were pretty far from shore, so Andy couldn't hear Pete probably, but he could tell by his arms flailing around that he needed help. So they got in the boat and they met him out there and helped Jesus and Pete pull up the nets and get the fish into the boats, filling both boats so full that they were starting to sink. Wonder what the limit was back then. Maybe it was DNR's day off. Pete is so amazed that he falls at Jesus' feet, saying, "Depart from me, I'm a sinful man, O Lord." When they finally get to shore unloading the fish, everyone is amazed. Even Pete's friend John and his brother James and their dad, who Pete was in business with, like a subcontractor. They, James and John and their crew, were just up the beach inside a larger boat mending their nets, not casting, for they were done fishing. They had caught their fill. They didn't get skunked. But they too were amazed when they saw the fish that Pete and the guys just hauled in. Jesus says to Peter and his brother Andrew, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." You might have better luck at this than fishing. No, he probably didn't say that last part, probably. Anyway, Andy and Pete, they drop their nets, and they follow him. They head up to the sand where he sees James and his brother John, like I said, inside the boat, mending their nets. If they were smaller boats, like Pete's boat, they would be out of the boat mending their nets. There's no room in the smaller boats. So they're in a big boat, mending their nets, in the boat with the hired help and their dad. John's family has got it going on. So they too, James and John, Jesus called also, and they too left everything. Left the family's business, their dad, the hired servants, guys on the payroll, and they left behind the boats. They went with Jesus down the coast to Capernaum. So here in the New Testament, we start to learn more about the relationship between Pete and his best bud, John. We learn that John could read and write quite well, better schooled than most. Pete, well, probably not. His gospel account, we believe, was written by Mark. And the second epistles of Peter were written by a guy named Silvanus, I think. Pete's family was probably not as well off as John's, but that didn't stop them from being best friends. Yes, Pete had his flaws, and so did John. They were both human. Heck, remember the time John and his brother James had their mommy ask Jesus to let them sit one on his right hand and the other on his left when he sits on his throne? Yeah, Big Thunder. I think this is why James and John got the nickname Sons of Thunder. Not because they tried to call down fire one time. No, Big Mom in the house, yeah. Well, I digress. Let me see. So, now when things happen, special moments with Jesus, and he often pulls the three aside. Peter, John, and John's brother James. These three amigos, three best friends. At the Transfiguration, Peter, John, and James. When Jesus raised the little girl who was dead, Peter, John, and James. The night of his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, while praying, it was Peter, John, and James. But in so much of the accounts, we see a special bond between Peter and John, these two guys. Jesus sends Pete and John alone to go prepare the Passover, the last one. The one Jesus said he has long desired to eat this one with all of them. At that Last Supper, when Jesus said one of them is going to betray them, Peter whispers to John, "Hey, psst, psst, John, ask him who it is." There's even things that John tells us that the other accounts don't. Some personal stuff telling me he and John and Jesus, they spent some time together, one-on-one. Quite often I think John was there when Nicodemus approached Jesus at night. You know, where Jesus told Nick at night, "You must be born again to experience the sequel." It was at that same meeting where Jesus said, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son." Yes, I think John was there. If not, Jesus maybe told him in private. He's the only one who wrote it, anyways, in the Gospels, the only one out of the four. Yeah. Now, when Jesus was arrested, it was Peter who drew the sword, ready to fight, loyal to the death for Jesus. He tried to lop off the head of the servant of the high priest, his ear. He tried to lop off his head. The sword glanced off the helmet and sliced off the ear of a guy named Malchus. The other Gospels, three of them, they don't mention the name of this servant, but John's Gospel account does. That's because John knew all these people from him and his mom selling fish there. They had an in with the religious leaders and the city leaders. Their family business. It gave him connections there. And so Pete takes off this guy's ear, and Jesus says, put the sword away. And he heals the guy. I remember just earlier that night, there were two swords they talked about. And I always wondered, where was the other sword? It wasn't drawn, I know that. Nobody drew that other sword. That's written of anyways. So at this point, all the disciples bug out and leave, but we read Pete followed at a distance in the shadows. I mean, after all, he just tried to kill a guy. Now, in the four Gospels, each written independently, they lay out the events and each giving some common details, describing the same events in the same manner. And then there are in each details that are not mentioned in the others' accounts. And at times it almost seems contradictory. But in fact, these differing specific accounts are actually complementary. They're painting the picture in a higher definition, high def, instead of 2D, 3D, or 4D. Liken it to two witnesses of a crime. One saw the perp, the Antifa hoodlum, from the front. Saw his face only. The other witness saw the perp from the backside only. He didn't see his face. And their descriptions to Popo seem contradictory. One who saw face only said he had short hair, positive of it, short hair. The one who only saw him from the back of the perp said, oh, this guy had long hair, no doubt. I saw it. He's got long hair. So it seems like two unreliable accounts. But the Antifa dude, he had a mullet. Yeah, it was short in front and long in the back. They were both right. Together they paint a more accurate picture of the commie. So, I'm going to share the details of the night and early morning that Jesus got arrested using the contradictory accounts of the four Gospels, and I'm going to put them together and watch how the scene unfolds with Pete and his best buddy John. So, a side note, it's often agreed that Luke's account was excerpts of Mary's, Jesus' mother's account, and it's interesting the things that she relayed by her that were important in regards to John and Peter. She saw things, and she knew those two boys pretty well. And Mark, we believe, was written by Peter. It's Peter's account, not written by Peter, but Mark wrote it, giving Peter's account of things that he shares of himself or chooses not to share. Likewise, what John shared about each other. The things they said and did, quite revealing, almost comical at times, and yet tender to others, revealing the bond of these two guys, the bond that they had. Like when the angel told Mary to go and tell the disciples and Peter, this was Peter's account. He remembered that point instinctively. And when John and Peter ran to the tomb, and John outran Peter, he whooped him in the race to the tomb, John told that account. Of course. It's funny. Yeah, Pete wouldn't have maybe wrote that one down. That little John beat me in a race. No. Anyways, so I put these things together. The accounts of that night, what happened with Peter in the garden, and then when Jesus got arrested and what happened there. I put all four together, did the homework for you, and you see how all these four different accounts really lay out a clearer picture of what happened that night. What was going on with Peter? Was he sitting by the fire? Was he standing by the fire? Was he in the courtyard? Was he inside the gate? All that. I'm just going to go through, read it to you, and it really paints a real clear picture here. In Luke 22:54, it says, they led Jesus away to the high priest's house. Pete's following at a distance. Then, in John, we read it's to the father-in-law of the high priest's house, the one really calling the shots. So outside this guy's house is a courtyard, but you have to get through a gate as it's a private residence, a gated community. And in Matthew 25, it says, we find Pete outside the gate wanting to get inside somehow. John's gospel also said that John knew the high priest and was there when Jesus brought him in. He went and spoke to the servant girl who was guarding the gate and told her to let Peter in. So John's family was accepted due to the business. All that, selling the fish there, and they knew everybody in town there. So John gets his buddy Pete in, and we see all these things unfold here. Matthew 26, it says, he went in and he sat with the servants to see the end. He hasn't completely bailed out. Pete's there. John's already inside too. In Luke, it says the guards and the servants had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and were sitting down together. Peter sits among them. Pretty brave. Then it says, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing him sitting by the fire, looked real hard at him, staring at him, and said, this guy was also with him. Then in John it says, the servant girl, the one who kept the door, the same one who let Peter in, for John, said to Pete, you're not also one of his disciples, are you? Then in Luke, but he denied it, saying, woman, I do not know him. And in Matthew, he denied it before them all. Mark, I don't even know or understand what you guys are even talking about. And he went over onto the porch, and a rooster crowed. Then in John 18, now there were some other servants and officers who made a fire of coals, and they stood there on the porch by the house, because it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood right there with them and warmed himself too. So he went from the courtyard to this porch. He's no longer sitting, now he's standing with these guys. Then in Mark it says, and the same servant girl saw him again, and began to say to those who stood by, this is one of them. And in Matthew, he went out back by the gate. So he walked away from those guys, and he's over by the gate now, maybe wanting to get out of there, as it's getting hot. The walls are closing in on him. Then another girl saw him and said to those who were there, this guy here, he was also with Jesus of Nazareth. But again he denied it with an oath this time and said, I swear I don't know the man. Then in Luke, he again denied it with an oath. I swear I don't know the man. Then Luke 22:59. After about an hour, another said, surely this dude also is with him. I have no doubt, for he's a Galilean. And in Matthew it says, a little later those who stood by came up and said to Pete, we know you are also one of them. It's your accent. It gives you away. Then in John, one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off, started eyeballing him. Hey, didn't I see you in the garden with him? And then Luke says, do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? I don't know what you're talking about, Pete says. Then in Matthew, then he began to curse and swear, saying, I do not know the man. And immediately a rooster crowed. Then in Luke, the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and they caught eyes. Wow. Then in Mark, Peter's written account of this says, then Peter remembered what Jesus had said to him, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And then in Luke, which would have been Mary's account, said, so Peter went out and wept bitterly. Yeah, he didn't stick around any longer. You see these different accounts, they paint a solid picture. Now let's get back to these 2 friends. The only one we see recorded at the cross was John. Where was Pete? He was alone in a dark place, I'm sure. Yeah, maybe even thought about ending it all. Now, his buddy John hadn't given up on him. Friends don't do that. Don't give up on your friends. At the empty tomb that morning, the morning that Jesus rose from the dead, the angel tells Mary, go tell the disciples Jesus is alive. He's risen. And the angel says, oh, and Mary, go tell Peter too. See, Pete wasn't with the rest of the disciples. He had pulled himself away from everybody. I'd say that's a little bit of depression going on. So when Mary does go and tell him, who is with Pete during his darkest hour? His best friend John is right there with him. Because they both together, when Mary tells them, they jump up together and they take off running towards the tomb. We need to be like that. When our loved ones, family, or friends are suffering, let's be there for them, with them. Not just pray for them, but pray with them. Oh, side note, John respected and loved Peter, and I think it shows when he goes to the tomb first. He peeked into the tomb. John beat him in this foot race. John peeks into the tomb, but he waited for Pete. He did not go in first. He let his BFF, Pete, go in first. He knew Pete really needed that moment, and he loved him. He respected him. And that's what John wrote in his account. Pete didn't mention that part, but John did, and because he was doing it for Pete. Best friends. So that's my story about two best friends. It's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Pete and John. Bye-bye.